Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Wild Wednesday talk. This evening it's Pete Lambert speaking about river ecology. Just to let you know that this is a pre-recorded talk, it's not live, so we won't be able to accept live questions, but we will put up the email address of the Shropshire Rivers Hub where you can post your questions and Pete will answer them later.
Good evening. This evening we're going to have a little wander through the world of aquatic ecology. Generally much an introduction to the topic. I'm Pete Lambert, I'm the River Projects Manager at Shropshire Wildlife Trust. We have a team of about 6 of us that specialise in freshwater projects, freshwater activity, restoration really of those water dependent habitats across the county. And I think it's quite useful just to kind of take a bit of a wander back to college, to school, to university, to that bit of reading, that documentary, and try and work out what are the foundation blocks of the thinking, the approaches that we take to aquatic ecology. So it's a study. It's about how we look at things, how we observe, how we measure stuff. It's that relationship between the biotic, the living things, and the abiotic, the non-living stuff, the rocks, the stones, the chemistry, and building those two together. It's oikosmology is the Greek derivative, the etymology of it, and it means the study of a home, your home place where you live. So ecology being a science, it's one of the sciences that flowed out of natural philosophy, and it attempts to understand the flows of energy, how nutrient cycling works, how water, this profound binding chemical, actually works, and mapping out how those different elements interact. Within ecology, we start to divide things up as we do with any science. We create a typology where we have different types of things. And one of the things that ecology does, it looks at a system approach and looks at dividing the earth into ecosystems. The earth itself is a large, massively complex ecosystem, but within it, you're able to very gently and sensibly design an approach in your mind, not designed, that's some other topic, at Star Wars and all that sort of thing. Anyway, where you have things like a mountain, you can roughly go, oh, that's a mountain. You've got the sea, oh, that's a coast. Grass, that's not trees, therefore that's a grassland. And each of these habitat types has got a distinctive characteristic, or is found in a certain place, or attracts and supports a certain range of wildlife or plants. So between those ecosystems, you get an area called an ecotone, where the coast becomes the land. Those salt impacts, that coastal impacts declines, and you find yourself standing on top of the cliff, and then suddenly you're inland a little bit, and you're into a different ecosystem with a different set of relationships. So for us, this evening we're just going to have a closer look at aquatic ecology, and that's the study of water-dependent ecosystems such as ponds, lakes, rivers, wetlands, estuaries, seas and oceans. And they are all dependent on a massive interplay of factors, and each of those derives some sort of characteristic, and it's the work of an ecologist is to understand that interplay between the living things and the non-living. So mentioned earlier, this is a lovely sort of map of the arterial water courses of Shropshire. Each of those river systems is influenced by its geology, how fast it flows, the chemistry of the water within it, the water quality, where it's placed, whether it's a lowland stream, whether it's an upland stream, how long it is, what the volumes of water are, whether it's in the south and it's starting to feel impacts from sort of rain shadows, or there's internal processes around different parts of the country being influenced by different sorts of weather. Climate is a significant factor in how the county behaves in terms of its patterns of what we'd call biogeography. So some species are located in different parts of the county or within the world because of biogeography, whether on the equator or closer to the poles. That has an influence on those types of habitat, those types of ecosystems that develop. So back into starting to get into some of the concepts that are useful within ecology. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got these relationships between different things, and the impact of one element within an ecosystem will cause changes elsewhere. So you might get an increase in predators, and then you get an impact on prey. So predator-prey relationships, feedback. You may have a pollution impact, which will knock back a certain element within an ecosystem or damage it or harm it. Development is a major issue with the balance of ecosystems. And these feedback loops are a way we understand those impacts ripple out through the ecosystem, and they can have either a negative impact or a positive one. Within any ecosystem, there is a limited, finite range of resources, and these might be plants or nutrients. They may be smaller organisms that are food for the organisms higher up, and there will be a competition. And certainly in some species, let's say fish, you will end up with at least one or two top predators, and their impact on that competition will be to sift out those prey species below them into different size classes, etc. Niche. Niche is a lovely word. It's really sort of soft and pleasant, and it just kind of describes the place where any particular species that's got preferences, it likes it dark, damp, they've evolved in a certain way. So I'm kind of working towards a slug type analogy here. So slugs fulfill a niche. They will eat certain detritus or debris. They don't like being out in the sun. They tend to lurk away under rocks and stones, but come out at night. And just as you develop this kind of niche idea, you realise actually slugs occupy quite a defined and narrow space within any ecosystem. Bats do the same thing. They've been around for about 30 million years, if not longer, and they occupy a particular niche. They've learnt to fly. They're mammals that fly. They fly at night to avoid predation because they're quite vulnerable to predators like falcons and hawks. And other raptors. So they fly at night, they eat colossal amounts of insects on the wings. They rarely land unless it's a particularly large insect like a maybug, which will carry them down to the ground. So their niche is they're aerial. They occupy across the summer about 50 different roosting locations. During the winter they need particular, let's say maternity roosts or whatever, to hibernate in. They've got to have a certain temperature range in order to become dormant during that period. So their niche is quite refined and extremely specialised. So you can see without a range of niches within an ecosystem, it has a limited number of opportunities for a declining number of species. So the more varied the niches are, or the more specialised they are, the greater number of species that could take advantage of them. And then finally in this little section, we've got carrying capacity. If we have too many of one species, it will just strip out the resources of that place, and that actually causes an issue in terms of balance and sustainability. So you get kind of like population crashes, whatever. So it's important to understand the carrying capacity, and that kind of plays itself out when you're looking at reintroduction schemes. Which generally can be quite unsuccessful because a lot of times there are limited understanding of the carrying capacity, the resources available for new species. The species may be present in quite an adequate level of number and certain population, and there may be no capacity for additional species to enter that particular ecosystem or that newly created habitat. So understanding carrying capacities again is critical in terms of understanding distribution of species. Let's say we'd give an example of that is the barn owl. Barn owls eat a certain number of small mammals over a day or a couple of days. If the number of small mammals declines because habitat's been lost, maybe grass regimes have intensified, therefore that particular area of territory will decline in terms of carrying capacity for a top predator like a barn owl, which sits there. It needs to feed its young at certain times. If there's low availabilities of food, then it can actually retain or impair its reproductive frequency, so it won't lay an egg, for simplicity's sake, because it knows there is insufficient carrying capacity in that environment, in that territory, for it to breed. So carrying capacity again is a concept that we need to just carry around in our heads. So we have feedback loops. These are these relationship loops between one species or one category of animal and another. There's constant competition for resources, and there's adaptation in terms of occupying niches, and then overall our ecosystem has a carrying capacity to support life at a certain level or frequency or rate. So back to our fundamental building blocks, we need water, we need energy, so energy from the sun is converted into oxygen and energy by the autotrophs, that's plants mainly, and consumers will eat the plants or eat the animals that are eating the plants to gather their energy, and they're heterotrophs. So they occupy a trophic level. It's kind of an eating level is what trophic means. Oxygen, we need oxygen to survive. We don't need a lot of oxygen, but we need just sufficient. And obviously there's a greater quantity of nitrogen in the atmosphere that is constantly recycled, either taken up by plants or absorbed in a different way. So you can see these building blocks are pretty fundamental. There's some sort of gross key bits of chemistry, sort of biogeochemistry going on here to understand these. And an ecologist needs to appreciate how these are shifting and moving through the system. In terms of nutrient recycling, there are, is it 13? I can never quite remember, but there are a group of micronutrients that occur in very, very small quantities like phosphate, potassium, and without them, growth is impaired or actually can't occur at all. Reproduction can't occur at all, and certainly with plants, when certain micronutrients are not present, the plants will either fail to grow, fail to reproduce, will produce small leaves, will be unable to photosynthesize, root development won't occur, etc., etc. So it's a whole range of things, but these are very, very small micronutrients, and associated those of things like mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is a form of very tiny, tiny fungal presence within soil. There's thousands and thousands of mycorrhizae, and what they do is they take a first stage breakdown of the nutrients from the abiotic, from the rocks and stones and geology, and actually allow that to be passed on to plants. Just like, as I say, extremely fundamental, really, really basic processes that allow us to start to understand how the aquatic ecology might be impacted or might work in a more insightful below the surface level. Another concept to chuck in here to start getting our heads around is biomass. Total value in ecosystem of living and dead organic matter is this kind of bald statement. Biomass as a production rate that you can measure as a gain or a loss as it declines or increases, and at different trophic levels you can see how that might change. So in the diagram here we've got large fish at the top which predate on fish below. The large fish will obviously defecate, or they will contribute material, organic material that will break down, that will feed the algae and diatoms. So there is a cycle occurring here. But if certain of these trophic levels are reduced or increased for whatever reason, then the biomass will be affected. And in certain cases, you can have a biomass of very small plants and animals, let's say of algae, at a very high level, that actually will impact on other levels within your system. So biomass is a way of measuring and starting to understand the amount of energy that's available and the form it's available in. So in an estuary, good example, the biomass levels are really, really high. But these are formed mainly of bivalves, univalves, and other creatures living in the estuarine mud. So they're available, but they're available to specialists like waders or other predators. But so the biomass is really high, but the sum of it is quite different from other areas where the biomass limits are very, very low, deserts, for example. So ecology, in order to kind of get its head around stuff, needs to continue classifying. It's a basic scientific technique. Taxonomy allows you to name things using a binomic appellation, so a name that's got two parts. And we're all quite familiar with the sort of kingdom, species, genera, cultivar, variety, etc. of that division. But in terms of understanding energy transfer between one level and another, we start to look at how animals how they eat or what they eat. So carnivores eat other animals. Herbivores, those heterotrophs, eat plants. Omnivores will eat both. And detrivores will specialise on eating material that started to break down already. So we can actually appreciate particularly a river system, and we start to understand that we've got a certain number of carnivores. They're dependent on this heron, for example, on fish at a certain size. But below them they have, there's a burrowing mayfly, or as a nymph there, and that exists within the sand and gravels of a riverbed, and tends to be an omnivore, eating a whole range of species at that level, or debris. Okay, so consumers, another way to cut the cake is to look at how animals and organisms eat, how they consume and take up energy. And these are just a few examples of your shredders, collectors, deposit feeders and predators. Great diving beetles are just phenomenal predators, and they seize small prey up to the size of tadpoles and consume them. Our ram's horn snail, though, is a bit of a grazer, will graze away. And then the freshwater pearl mussel is a filter feeder, will draw in particles, organic particles, and then blow them out, the remains that it hasn't consumed. So different ways of consuming energy and moving it up and down the trophic chain. So again, ecology is also giving you some starting points in how to understand the role of the things you might find on a day out by the river. And the simplest way of understanding it is the food chain, moving from the smallest organisms all the way up to the complex, the top predators. There's a food web. Things don't just move in a vertical fashion, they move sideways and up and down and through the system in lots of different ways. And eventually you'll end up with, start to understand that if a certain species is removed through predation, pollution, there will be impacts on the relationships within the food chain, and some of those will be cascade interactions that cause significant problems elsewhere. So one of the good examples of that is the work done on vultures in India, which was discovered actually their processing power in terms of dead species and scavenging contributed to the control of certain problem zoonoses, sort of bacteria, and by removing the vultures from the food web, we had a growth of a whole range of other problems. So you do need a balanced food web, and taking very sensible precautions about how you manipulate that is very extremely sensible and wise. So looking at the different components of a food chain, we have a whole range of very small things. So plants, protozoa, bacteria, fungi that coalesce, they all interact with oxygen levels, with nutrient levels. They respond to, they indicate those factors and at what rate they're occurring. So blue-green algae, for instance, will, when it breaks down overnight, will actually strip oxygen out of a system. And a great range of the blue-green algae, the sort of image in the bottom right, is indicative of high levels of nutrient, probably greater than would be there normally or in its natural state. So aquatic organisms at a microscopic level have got a story to tell and help us understand water quality and water management. Moving up the trophic level, we have our marginal, emergent, floating, submerged and peripheral plants. It's quite useful dividing them up in this way. It helps with identification quite quickly, and it also helps us understand the different niches that are being created by the form, by the abiotic shape of a water body, whether it's a pond, a lake or whatever. And we also understand each different pond, for example, tends to support a slightly different plant community, even when a relatively small area, let's say 10 ponds within a 2 kilometre by 2 kilometre square, it's called a tetrad, is each pond will generally have a slightly different plant community than its neighbours, even at quite a small level or even quite a gross level. The distribution of plants will be different, the location will be different, and it's quite useful to start off with this framework of marginal, emergent, floating to start to understand the levels of distribution of different sorts of plant before you even get on to naming them, which in some cases can be quite difficult. Our aquatic organisations at the invertebrate level again are divided up quite quickly and effectively. So we got some flatworms at the top illustrated there, the planaria. We have Hemiptera, the bug family. That's a water skater sitting on top of the surface. And we have a mayfly. This is a swimming mayfly, one of the Bettidae. It's torpedo shaped. It's adapted to moving very quickly in fast flowing streams. Bottom left we have a white-clawed crayfish. There's one of the native varieties, one of the larger crustaceans in British waters. And then finally one of the water spider. There's only one water spider, which is quite useful because they're quite a complex group to identify. So again, we're sort of dividing up the ecosystem usefully into different family groups of different sorts of larger macro-invertebrates. And again, that helps us understand what's occurring within this particular ecosystem. Moving on again to vertebrates, we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals and birds. So we have a lovely minnow at the top, small fish, good food source for our kingfishers, brown trout, salmonids, pike, all of which are quite aggressive predators of small fish. Some of the things like crucian carp are also predators of small fish. We have a water shrew, not often seen, but a rare and delightful sight when they are. Again, sort of partial adaptation to water environments. It can swim, it doesn't mind swimming, it's not a particularly good swimmer, but it does occupy a niche, quite a unique niche by being able to swim. And being a shrew, it's an insectivore, so it will eat insects or invertebrates rather than browsing sort of green growth like water voles. We have a grass snake, one of the reptiles, very elegant swimmer, and on this occasion accompanied by a damselfly, which is rather nice. So birds occupy, they don't swim, although one of them might do actually, I lie. And amphibians again are sort of top, very visible wildlife that we will find in aquatic habitats, and all have their preferences in terms of water quality, water quantity, water quality, in terms of their energy demands on an environment, how many newts you can have in a pond, how far they need to travel to take advantage of the breeding territory, which for an amphibian tends to be terrestrial, in terms of hiding away post-breeding season. So they need the pond for breeding, they need a bit of terrestrial habitat for the rest of the year. So they interact between those two, so their habitat demands are quite sophisticated. A pond alone is not sufficient for our amphibians to complete their breeding cycle. They need to come out of there to grow on before they can return to breed. And the same with all the vertebrates. They tend to be partially dependent on aquatic environments, unlike the fish, which are totally dependent. So I've mentioned on and off through the sort of exploration of aquatic ecology these impacts. Water quality, significant one. Pollution instance, whether it's hydrocarbons, whether it's oil, or rise in pH or temperature, can actually affect water quality. This will impede on the ability for aquatic organisations to thrive, to reproduce, for specialist ones to survive if the parameters that they tolerate are exceeded, i.e. it's too acidic or it's too alkaline, or turbidity, that's the clarity of the water is impacted. Water quantity is significant. As water quantity declines, you've got less of it, it tends to warm up much quicker. Those increased temperatures at a certain point will begin to activate organic breakdown, which will start to remove oxygen from the water. So quality, quantity are significant factors. We tend to abstract all of our drinking water, apart from some from groundwater sources, from rivers. So if we have a human impact on the availability of water for life, whether that's ours or wildlife as a whole. So other little notions here that we need to kind of get our head around are bioaccumulation. So certain chemicals like mercury will enter a water course through, let's say, an industrial source, and will slowly move up the food chain by transfer through the food web, and in those species that are heterotrophs, i.e. eating others, they will accumulate. So they accumulate in the muscle tissue or in the larger organs of a creature. And we, as top predators, sitting at the top of that, we tend to accumulate a whole range of chemicals at very, very low levels that when they're analysed are rather shocking and disturbing to find that we have and carry around in us quite a range of quite highly toxic chemicals at very, very low levels that we have bioaccumulated, whether that's from eating a tin of tuna or taking a sea fish, a saltwater fish and frying it on our barbecue, or through the route of meat, or eating plants. So bioaccumulation passes up and through the food chain, through the food web, and again in quantity can affect plants and animals higher up the chain. Biomagnification, so some of the chemical effects of certain substances will become amplified and will become worse. And I think I've sort of dropped down endocrine disruption. So we develop and reproduce for a whole series of hormonal messages within our systems, and that's true of all other larger animals. And by the impact of chemicals, that will disrupt that process, and we'll end up growing in unhealthy ways, or parts of our bodily function. I mean, our biota, I mean wildlife as a whole, humans and the other animals that occupy the world. So endocrine disruption is a significant impact, and we're quite familiar with that, particularly, let's say, in fish, when it starts to become really obvious that there's a problem, or you get reproductive harm or impairment. So animals are unable to reproduce, eggshells are thin and break before the bird has gone to full term and hatched, or the chick. So endocrine disruption comes from a whole range of chemicals, and a single car tyre, just to give an instance, is a composite item. and it contains over 40 different sorts of base chemicals have gone into its production, and if it's left in a watercourse, it will leach those chemicals out over a period of years, and those leached toxins will affect wildlife and water quality. Atmospheric pollution, clearly we are all, those of a certain age will be familiar with acid rain, which started to affect the pH in our water courses, caused by atmospheric pollution from industrial processes in the Far East, or the sort of Near East in Europe, and they were detected in Scandinavia as they were blown in the higher atmosphere and then deposited in rain. Basically the chemicals stuck to the raindrops and stuck to water. Water as a chemical is a fantastic diffuser. It'll absorb or combine with a whole range of things. You can dilute all sorts of stuff in water. It's a very simple chemical, so it's quite easy to appreciate that atmospheric pollution is a significant cause of change in terms of water quality or water stasis. Physical damage, a bit more easy to understand. When something's battered, it will, particularly let's say a tree, will have a response. It will attempt to mend the wound, but it will tend also to be more vulnerable to bacterial or viral attack, and diseases will spread. It's rather like us. When we're weakened, we tend to be more prone to get a cold, or to be open to infection. And finally, in this particular sort of section, we're looking at climate change. We're aware since measurements began, sort of over 200 years ago, that CO2 is rising in the atmosphere. We can't deny this. We're having human impacts on a global scale. Land loss to development is increasing, particularly over the last 50 years at an exponential rate. That has got to have an impact, and that impact has been measured, and it's very clear that we have to take a response to that across the board. So climate change will impact aquatic ecosystems in all the ways that I've already outlined and mentioned. So just a few more, just sort of drilling down really, just getting to the downhill run of this evening's talk. Invasive plants, these tend to be plants that were found somewhere else, have been brought in terms of their biogeography out of that place. A lot of them from in this picture from the Himalayas or from the Far East. They've been introduced for one reason or another, whether accidentally because they're ornamentals, or they've been introduced accidentally because they're tiny, and people haven't appreciated that they're actually, now they're out of their comfort zone, they're in a place where it's actually even more comfortable. Their natural predators and the natural constraints on their spread are no longer present. Himalayan balsam is an annual. It spreads by firing an explosive seed a considerable distance, and it grows rather quickly, and it will occupy a niche that used to be occupied by native plants that tended to be a mixture of biennials, i.e. every other year, or perennials. But being an annual, the Himalayan balsam dies back in the winter, lives bare soil on the riverbank, and that bare soil is flushed into the river and causes issues with other species and organisms. So invasive plants create a negative cascade. So they arrive, they outcompete, and they cause significant problems elsewhere for those rarer native plants that might have occupied that niche before. Zebra mussels, they are a filter feeder. We've had a look at mussels earlier, and what they tend to do is occupy a trophic level within the web, the food chain, and they will remove much of the plankton because they are over capacity. So they affect the carrying capacity of the water and create an imbalance in fish communities. They also have a physical impact by blocking pipes and clogging cooling systems, and that leads to economic issues, and they've spread incredibly rapidly across Europe, and are now found in significant areas of the UK. So we've explored lots of different concepts around aquatic ecology, and we've given some examples of how, if we don't delve down and understand the complexity of aquatic ecosystems and understand the far-reaching impacts of different factors, that certain of our flagship species like the brown trout, which has seen significant declines, how we can actually carry out recovery programs, how we can stop pollution, how we can protect the parts of the ecosystem that are critical to their successful reproduction. So you can see here the brown trout, like many complex creatures, has a long cycle of reproduction. It's dependent at various times in its life cycle for different sorts of habitat, and it's quite intolerant to some of the changes. So just for example, its temperature tolerance is between 8 or 9 degrees C, so that's relatively cool water, and certainly with climate change, loss of the cooling effect of trees along a riparian corridor or river corridor, increase in certain chemicals, turbidity, loss of volume in terms of water quantity. Then the brown trout that likes it cold, likes the water rich and fast moving, likes gravels that are free so it can excavate and lay its eggs in them, is in significant difficulty. And I think aquatic ecology allows us to start to understand and hopefully explain what those issues might be and how to address them. There are complex relationships between different creatures. Some, like the mink and the otter, are predators. The otter's larger than the mink. It tends to displace the mink if it can. The mink will avoid the otter, but there is predation pressure on the water vole. The water vole is in steep and horrifying decline, particularly since the 1990s. There was some sort of trigger point, a tipping point, in which the impact of habitat loss primarily, the overtiding of our water courses, the increase in the cutting and removal of vegetation, the straightening and the physical loss of their habitats obviously coincided with predator pressure. Now, water voles are resistant to predator pressure if they've got sufficient habitat of sufficient complexity so they can hide. Once you reduce that level of complexity, they've got nowhere to hide and predator pressure will increase and have an impact. So the relationship is complex. It's difficult to put numbers on, but it's clear that these three animals will have a relationship to each other that will need understanding. The mink is an invasive, so it has an impact on a system that may be balanced without it. There may be sufficient water voles if they had enough habitat to survive the recovery of the otter. Otters eat other things, for instance. Mink are indiscriminate and quite voracious members of the mustelid family, same family as the otter, but without habitat resilience and complexity, the water vole will continue its steep decline. So again, aquatic ecology will focus on these types of relationship rather than heathlands or solitary bees. Mentioned a number of times the idea of a niche, and here's a sort of a very splendid version of this adaptation. Tunnels into natural riverbanks to protect its young, needs a certain level of fry and small fish presence to eat, but it will only eat to a certain extent, and they occupy a territory. If the prey species drops below a certain level, then there's not enough space for them, not enough carrying capacity. So there's a lovely kingfisher just close to where we're doing our talk this evening. They will lay a certain number of eggs dependent on food availability. So they've adapted extremely strongly to their niche, and evolutionary adaptations include things like a transparent third eyelid so that they can see underwater more effectively. So colossal niche adaptation. They also need perches, relatively clear water most of the time. They can hunt in poorer conditions, but they certainly need a healthy water course in order to survive and thrive. So niche adaptation, good to understand how to provide when we're looking at recovery and restoration programs, sort of nature recovery networks around the river systems, is that we will need to provide for these animals here by supporting the lower trophic levels within the food chain. And then finally, I think it's just to leave you with something to ponder. When we look at conservation and applying the ecological understanding we have, it's critical that we actually take the view of the animals and wildlife itself. And Jacob von Uexküll, many years ago, coined the word Umwelt to understand the kind of the world view of animals. And when we look at, let's say, a badger path, badger paths tend to be only about sort of 7 or 8 inches high. Bracken tends to form little tunnels or through the grass. They tend to look at this kind of 7-inch above the ground view. That's their world. And it's too easy for us to have this anthropomorphic human-based view. I'm only 5'9", I'm getting smaller all the time. But that my view from my eye level is not sufficient and is the wrong perspective to understand the world from an animal's point of view. And each organism has got its own world view that requires respecting and incorporating into the way we think about the way of conserving, protecting and preserving the natural world. So I'll leave that with that one to ponder, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was an excellent talk. Don't forget to post any questions on the Shropshire Rivers Hub, and equally don't forget to become a member of Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you in the future.